Thank you everyone so much for joining this morning or evening, wherever you're dialing in from. My name is Tina Park. I am the head of inclusive research and design for Partnership on AI, and we're really excited to have this session with all of you today on practicing inclusivity in AI. I'm joined by three amazing members of our Global Task Force for Inclusive AI, and I think we'll just get started right now. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are Partnership on AI. We are a nonprofit organization based here in North America. And our purpose is to bring together voices from across the AI community to create resources for advancing positive outcomes for people and society. So not a pretty big task to do, but we love doing it. And we work with experts and practitioners from across the field, from academia, civil society, and industry to really tackle some of the biggest questions that are facing the field today. One of the ways that we do this is we take a multi-stakeholder approach. So the first thing that we do is we cultivate community by bringing together those practitioners from these different sectors. We work with them to identify some of the biggest ethical tensions that arise from the work that we are doing, whether that is AI safety concerns, fairness and accountability with algorithmic systems, media integrity, questions around labor and the future of work. And the area that I lead is specifically around how we can do this work more inclusively by working with socially marginalized communities in the development and deployment of AI. And as many of us know from working in this field, doing that is not quite as easy as it sounds. And so thinking about where those tensions arise from when we are trying to prioritize humans in the development of these new technologies. Once we've had a chance to do that and have some of those difficult conversations, we work towards producing resources and recommendations in order to support those practitioners like you who are working in this space. For this particular project that we worked on as a global task force, we really focus on the needs of commercial sector developers who are trying to work with different stakeholders. The guidance that I'll be sharing with you today was developed over the past really almost 2 years now in consultation with the Global Task Force on Inclusive AI. This task force is a body of leading practitioners and researchers from across academia, civil society, industry, and policy. And we're all focused on establishing a framework for ethical and inclusive public engagement practices for the field. And we decided to really specifically think about the dynamics that arise when commercial developers are trying to do this, because we understand that when you're working in the commercial sector, sort of with profit-driven motivations, a lot of different issues can arise when you're trying to work with communities, particularly socially marginalized communities. We recognize that there is a difference in power and decision-making authority that can arise. And so we want to make sure that we are attending to some of those specific needs, recognizing that those things also arise for folks working in different sectors as well. But as you can see, this is an incredible group and probably names and faces that you recognize from their own research, scholarship, and activism in this space. And so I feel very, very fortunate to have been able to work with this group. When selecting members of the task force, we really focus on people with a breadth of experience working on this topic, not just from a theoretical standpoint, but actually having tried to develop different methodologies, different approaches, different recommendations, whether for internally for their own organizations or out in the field. Because what we really want to learn from is that, this is not a new topic or a new issue that's facing the field. We know that people have been grappling with this for quite a while. Other industries and sectors, myself, I come from sociology and urban planning. This has been a core feature of how we do our work in other sectors. And so can we learn from both the mistakes that other folks have made in the past, but also some of the innovation that has arisen outside of the AI field? And so you'll notice that there is, the group is quite interdisciplinary and also comes from different sectors in order to be able to capture all of that expertise. So let's get into it. What do I mean by participatory public engagement? Really, it's the process for actively soliciting the input of individuals, communities, and organizations in the development and deployment of AI technology. And we're really thinking about it in terms of those who are directly and indirectly affected by the application of these technologies. So it expands us from just thinking about it in terms of user experience, where you're thinking about the direct user or your direct clients, and thinking about folks who are also sort of maybe a couple degrees removed, but ultimately their lives will be transformed because of the deployment of these AI systems. And we're thinking about it in terms of those who are coming from socially marginalized and vulnerable communities, because we recognize that not everyone gets to sort of have equal footing and equal voice in a process. We're also thinking about it in terms of practices that are seen throughout the AI development and deployment lifecycle, not just at the beginning or at the very end when we're testing, to see if the product works. And then how we do it is through consultative, collaborative, and sometimes even co-creative activities. And we distinguish between these three types because they involve a very different kind of level of engagement and the amount of decision-making that is ceded over to others outside of the actual development team. So things like consultative might mean that you are just literally consulting them for their input. You take what you find useful from their feedback and you go and implement it. Collaborative might require a bit more back and forth and iteration, where you tell them what they're going to do, they give you a bit more feedback, you go try it, come back to them with some input around what you've tried and seeing where it goes. Whereas co-creative means that you're starting from the ground up, everything you decide together. The community members have a sense of equal ownership over what is being built. And then finally, why do we do it, right? Why engage, do participatory public engagement at all? And really it's to ensure that the technology is not just functional and marketable, but it's actually ethically sound and socially responsible. That when you're trying to build, you're actually building for the benefit of the people that you're building for. And we think about this because there is a world in which you don't do this with the input of quote unquote outsiders. And it's not a particularly good world. These are just a handful of headlines from the last couple of years that have showed like what happens when AI and algorithmic systems can go wrong, in the sense that it causes harms when they are deployed. My favorite sort of low-tech story that's still involved in algorithm is the Stanford vaccine algorithm during the peak of the COVID pandemic, where Stanford University tried to somewhat automate its allocation of who got the first batch of vaccines. Ended up turning out that the algorithm suggested healthcare workers who were allowed to work from home and not actually even in the hospitals and frontline workers. And so that's sort of one small example, but there are other sort of more catastrophic ones, like the ways that facial recognition technology is deployed and unduly targets and doesn't work well with darker skinned faces, and how that sort of contributes to existing racial inequality and issues with the carceral system. And so the way that we think about it is that even though AI itself may be a technical innovation, its creation and its impact are ultimately socio-technical. So they lie at that intersection between social impact and the technical innovation itself. And we have to think about it within that sort of fuzzy gray area of that dynamic between people impacting the technology and technology impacting the people. And so really, just to echo again, like why are we really pursuing this point of participatory public engagement? It's really important to learn from others to gain different insights around, what those different opportunities are that might be served by emergent technology that we may not be thinking about, including the question of whether or not technology is actually the best approach or may not be the best approach to solve that problem. It's a way to foresee and manage potential risks and harms that, especially as a small development team or even a larger organization, just may not have the capacity to see all the different angles to a situation. And having people from different backgrounds and life experiences are able to identify things that you may not be able to see yourself. And we also want to recognize the fact that technology doesn't impact all people in the same kind of way. And so thinking about it in terms of different groups may engage with the technology differently, may be impacted by that technology differently. And it's important for us to understand what those differential risks and harms might be. It's also a way to ensure that there's a smoother adoption of new processes and products as you're introducing a new technology or a new way of doing something. It's important to recognize circumstances where it may not work as intended, or there might be friction points that arise for its adoption, and being able to address those things early on and build around it is a great way to ensure that your products are actually reaching the markets that you're hoping to reach. And then finally, it's a way to strengthen relationships with different stakeholder communities and the public. So much about releasing new technology is about building trust with the people who are ultimately going to use it or be impacted by it. And so continuously working with different communities is a way to build that trust over time rather than just having an expectation that people will immediately think what you're doing is a great idea. And we worked on releasing a set of guidelines because unfortunately, trying to do public participation or public engagement work is actually really difficult. And there's ways in which that doing it in ways that are misaligned with the public's needs, a community's needs, can actually erode trust rather than build it. So ways that happens is, we've been hearing this term a lot more often these days, so ethics washing, where, you say that you're going to change something, you're working with the community, you spend all this time and money, holding, workshops and different public events, but nothing actually changes. And so people's trust is eroded when they realize, oh, you just did this to make yourselves look like you're going to be listening to me, listening to the public, but actually you're still just going to do exactly what you plan to do. It can also erode trust when there's opaque decision making. So you do decide to make those changes, but they're not clearly and regularly communicated to those who are impacted. And so it's unclear where where their voice is actually having impact, and ways in which they're actually influencing how they're shaping the product that's getting produced. Inconsistency can also erode trust. That just means like sometimes some changes are made while other recommendations are completely ignored without justification. And that leaves people in a position of not being able to understand, like, why did they decide to listen to us on this one point, but they completely ignored this other very important piece of feedback we gave them. And again, that lack of communication, lack of explanation and transparency can really erode people's sense of trust with both you as a team and also the product itself. And then finally, something that we may not talk about as often, but something to be really mindful of is that the process itself can be coercive. So it means that, and this can be done both intentionally and unintentionally. So we can think about intentional coercion as situations where you explicitly design the engagement or the conversation to really limit people's opportunities to have choice or to actually express what they feel or have critiques around. And so the discussions themselves may be designed for predetermined outcomes or they're very limited. So it's a way of, quote unquote, like rubber stamping a situation. So they might be asked very leading questions like, you like this product, right? You think this works great, right? And there's sort of a clear indication like you're not supposed to agree. But it can also be done in indirect ways or unintentionally where people don't necessarily always feel safe giving you critical feedback where you disagree with how something is turning out. So that might be a situation where you work with other employees in in your company, say like an employee resource group, to get their sort of early feedback on an issue or product, and no one feels particularly safe giving bad feedback or telling you like, hey, you shouldn't do that because they're worried about losing their jobs. This also might be the case if you're working with subcontractors like data enrichment workers, where they want to give you some good feedback around how to improve the process, but they're worried about not getting hired back on again as a subcontractor. And so even though maybe like you yourself have created an environment where they can give feedback, critical or positive, they may not feel generally safe because of the overall structure of the relationship to be able to provide that to you freely. And so thinking through sort of not just what you're doing as the person who's leading these efforts, but overall as an organization, are there power dynamics in place that might create a situation where someone might not feel safe telling you exactly what they're thinking or feeling, again, are ways in which the process may not go as intended and actually erode the trust that you're trying to build. So with all of this in mind, we developed what we hope is a very useful resource for you. This is the guidance for inclusive AI. And Josh, if you could drop the link to it, because it is a web-based resource. It's designed for different audiences to give you sort of an opportunity to learn more about what public participatory engagement is, but also get some help as you're developing your own strategies around the different projects that you might be working on. We've designed this for 3 different levels of familiarity with this sort of process and domain of public participation. One are business leaders. We recognize that people who are oftentimes making decisions around whether or not your team or your organization should be doing public engagement are not always the ones who are actually directly involved in the process. And so they don't need to know every single detail around like how to do the engagement, but they do need to understand why that work is important and what value it's going to bring to the business by doing so. And so for business leaders, we try to keep it really short because we recognize that they're busy. They don't oftentimes read the 40, 50, 100-page documents that I really like to write. And we try to keep it really hyper-focused on, what is it they can do to understand the value of public participation, but also how to support the teams that are actually doing it, and understanding some of those high-level values that are important to leading their organizations towards this work. The next audience that we built around for, and this is a really important audience for us, are developers and deployers who are new to this public engagement practice, or is trying to come back up to speed around what's happening. And so this is where we do the deep dive around what is it, what do we mean by it, what are some of the debates around it, where do these practices come from? We talk through we'll take you through things like, who are the different actors and institutions to be mindful of as part of this larger public participation landscape. And so we think about, within a company, who are the different decision makers that might be thinking about or have a role in ensuring that your organization actually implements these strategies, versus like on the public side, public is a really broad concept. How can we break that down so it's a little bit more manageable, so you actually understand who you're trying to reach out to and work with, and what those different sort of types of stakeholders and participants actually have to offer for you as part of the process, and what their incentives and risks might be for working with you on this endeavor. And then we try to break down sort of public engagement strategies as a whole into more smaller component parts, so that you understand how different choice points really allow you to make different decisions around how aligned or misaligned what you ultimately produce as public engagement practices might be from your actual intention. So we do that deep dive. If you're a little bit unfamiliar, or if you're absolutely new to this, I highly recommend you start there. It is sort of your 101 course, so that you don't have to try and tackle this by yourself. And we try our best to cite out to different sources so you can check it out and just take your time to really learn more about this new topic for you. And then finally, recognizing that we have a lot of other practitioners who have been trying to do this work for years. And so we have a resource for developers and deployers who are pretty experienced and familiar with this. And we recognize that for you, really, you don't need that background information. What you really need is sort of another thought partner to help you think through, what am I missing? What are different alternatives that I can try? What are topics that I should bring up with my team so that we can have a fuller conversation about that? And so what we do there is we've generated what I think is a really cool tool. It's a custom guidance generator. And so what you do is you input some features of the project that you're working on. So recognizing that different types of models have different requirements and needs and considerations for the type of stakeholder engagement that you're going to do. And then thinking about what your engagement objective is. So we think about public engagement strategies as sort of a larger endeavor with multiple components to it. And so thinking through what you might need to do if you are just trying to think through what is a new market that we need to be reaching? How can we discover more about them? How do we need to understand what their needs are, is going to be different from maybe 10 steps down the line after you've actually developed your product, you've gone through all those processes, and you're trying to figure out okay, what do we need to do differently to make sure that we are understanding the possible risks and failures for the new system that we've built before maybe getting into thinking about what you need to do for oversight once you've actually released your product. And so this widget is here to help you sort of think through each of those different phases. You can start to piece it together based on sort of what your different needs are, and it's really designed for you to come back to over and over again. And so we hope that it's helpful for you. It stays at sort of this meso level. It's not super high level principles. We cover that in a different section of the guidance. It's sort of mid-level, more highly specific to both the model type and the sort of situation or the objective that you're trying to achieve. And it'll give you some aligned and misaligned practices to think about to help you sort of specify your thinking as well. And there's a little link at the bottom if you go through that. If there's anything you feel like we're missing, or there's big questions that you still have, please use that form to let us know, because we want to be continuously updating this to both also stay attentive to the changes that are happening in the field, but also recognizing that we did a pretty solid brainstorm of all the different problems that people experience from different types of organization types and different projects that they're working on, but we know that we didn't capture everything. All right, and with that, um, I'm going to be turning over to our panel, and that I'm very, very excited to introduce you all. I'm going to give you a chance to take a look at their beautiful headshot photos before I turn off my screen share and just move to our regular screen. All right. And Josh, if you wouldn't mind maybe taking my face off of the screen and making sure that all of us are available. Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, so quickly to introduce, we have first Juanis Becerra Sandoval, who is a historian of science and technology and a staff research scientist in the Responsible Tech Group at IBM Research. Their research leverages archival methods and critical theory to analyze the social, cultural, economic, and political incentives that uphold harmful and exclusionary assumptions in technology development and use. In addition to their research work at IBM, which really feeds into the work that IBM on the product side are also utilizing and building from, they co-founded and served as the founding executive director of the Center for Black, Brown, and Queer Studies, a nonprofit organization that advances equity-driven science and technology studies. Next, we have Afsane Rigo, who is the founder and principal investigator of the D Center, an interdisciplinary center on community-based research, corporate accountability, and technology design interventions that works to reduce the mass-scale harms of existing and emerging technologies. Her work has focused on law, human rights, and technology with a focus on highly marginalized populations, as well as general privacy and security topics. She is a principal researcher and author behind a phenomenal methodology called Design from the Margins, which I believe we'll be linking. She previously worked with Article 19 as a senior researcher on human rights issues with a focus on LGBTQ rights and corporate responsibility in the Middle East and North Africa region. And then finally, we have Stephen Rockwell, who is the founder of HumanServices.ai, which is an organization whose mission is to enable the social impact field with knowledge, models, and products to make transformative change possible by delivering insights on AI and enabling innovations that leverage intelligent automation to deliver lasting social impact. At HSAI, Stephen builds responsible AI with a number of nonprofit and government clients and partners with social finance to deliver the government AI learning and innovation hub. So he's one of the builders that we have on the task force. He also serves as a senior technical advisor in the Outcomes AI practice at Project Evident. He was previously served as Chief Digital Officer at Benefits Data Trust and the Chief Program Officer and Chief Technology Officer at Charity Navigator. So it's an incredible group. Just to kick us all off, Juanis, I'll start with you. How do inclusive participatory practices show up in the work that you do over at IBM Research?
Thanks, Dina. So for me personally, the majority of the participatory engagements that I've been working on are focused on the evaluation moment. So less so at the moment of design and development, but more so focused on evaluating and assessing the risk of particular technologies, products, services within IBM. And alongside my colleague Felicia Jing and other members of the Responsible Tech team of IBM Research, our focus has really been in understanding, one, the labor dynamics of participatory work within a business context, and particularly the kind of role that profit incentive plays within participatory engagements. And then methodologically, our focus has been on disagreement. We are very interested in kind of seeing how we can foster more disagreement within participatory engagements, because they tend to be focused on maybe a rubber stamp, or in some cases of like, what does this community as a whole agree on is important to them. So we've been kind of focusing on disagreement. And then maybe the last thing to comment is that in moments of evaluation, it's kind of really frequent that technologists who are testing a product or conducting any kind of benchmark testing, that they will impose normative values, beliefs, and assumptions. And so in those moments, participatory research is really important. So we've been kind of focused on that primarily.
Incredible. Thank you. Stephen, let's turn to you. How is it showing up in the work that you do?
Yeah. First, let me just say thanks. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. And it's been a real honor to participate on this global task force. We had a bunch of people that are a lot smarter than me that are focused on these issues. And so I think the outcomes that you've seen are attributed to this group. And I see there's even some folks online from the task force, like Bill Curtis Davidson and some others. So it's been a real honor to participate, and I really the outcomes have been tremendous, and I think really useful for all of us. I think on this particular question, I had wanted to say that participatory and inclusive AI is synonymous with actually doing AI well. That it's not something over there someplace, it's not an add-on or tack on to the process, but it's actually, at least in the social impact space where I'm in, with government and nonprofits, this is how we do the work. And we can get into some of the practical pieces or applications of that later, but um, principally that in order to deploy, well, that we're not so enamored with AI itself, but it's AI is a means to solve some social impact set of issues. And to do that sense making up front really does require community engagement, especially those who are going to be most affected. And then as we go along and we start building something, the check-in points to say, is this actually working for you, all the way through evaluation and deployment? That is part of the guidance that we're providing in this, which is really, really important. It's not sort of at the end or at the beginning, but throughout, that engagement is only going to make the tooling or the AI or the model better. And in social impact use cases, um, you can build it and no one will come. So like that's the alternative to not doing this well.
Thanks so much. Austin, I'll turn to you. What are some of the ways that these practices show up in the work that you do?
Thank you so much. So wonderful to be here with you all, and I echo Stephen on how this was a really wonderful learning process, learning from a lot of the folks that were involved from different angles, and the work Tina and the team did to try and consolidate all of that into a tool, which was a feat. So I come from a different side of this work. Our work isn't completely focused on AI, although it comes in the way we bring in the sort of investigations and documentation of harms, and the changes we push for is based on how the people in the communities we work with are impacted by a particular technology. And more so, AI becomes brought up, entangled, or sort of seen as a particular avenue as well. So the type of way we work at the D Center, and the design from the margins has worked, is really at its core intertwined with working with communities. And we're pretty specific about the communities we work with from a standpoint, from a organizational philosophical strategy standpoint of working with highly marginalized and criminalized communities. And this is often to reflect the lack of sort of involvement of many of these communities in these processes, and also the very varied and complex layers that the criminalization element being sort of state and power influences of the experiences of communities, and their interactions with tech. And so, you know, when it comes to thinking about participatory work, sometimes I think about it in terms of like the technologists or the companies or others who come and work with us are the ones being brought in into the participatory process. And so it's, that sort of dynamic often is useful, especially when we're setting the ground rules and trying to do some of this work based on documented harms, but also needs and translating that. And I think it comes into the work very heavily, but it's also a very strategic push because the sort of ingenious maneuvering and necessity of survival that the communities with these multiple identities of marginalization and criminalization around the world bring really point to a pinnacle of how we can design technologies that actually last, are wanted, and don't add to the continuous cycle of carceral harms that we're seeing, and create something that's robust, create something that's good. As we were just saying earlier, Stephen was saying earlier, you were saying earlier, it creates something that actually sustains, is functional, as we've seen. This is a ongoing curse of the race to domination in the tech industry. We're seeing is that the lack of understanding of what actually occurs and the harm that occurs leads to really dysfunctional, harmful tech that doesn't last. And so it's weaved into our work really from the beginning, and will continue to be.
Thank you. So all of you are folks who have helped or are actually building the technology yourselves, trying to integrate these different practices in, and I think to some degree through trial and error as well. And you've pointed out already to some of the issues that kind of arise. So Stephen, you mentioned like oftentimes it can be seen as tangential, it's as opposed to being an integral part of the actual development, like technical development process. Juanis, you mentioned about this challenge of like how do you create space for disagreement and leveraging that disagreement to actually produce something good. I'm hoping the three of you can touch on maybe sort of what are some of the other challenges that you've experienced when trying to integrate these practices into your own work. Do you see it happening with your other colleagues, or are you sort of also still standing a bit alone trying to do this work in this kind of really thoughtful and engaged way? Stephen, can I start with you?
Sure. I think there's maybe more of this even than what we think is happening in some ways, especially outside of the US context. Although we're trying to take those practices and put them into a US context. So what do I mean by that? The EU law on AI, one of the few out there that's comprehensive, actually mandates the state actors set up sandboxes to create a sort of safe space to evaluate models, to evaluate AI technologies. That's something that we're doing here. I'm doing with social finance in building a sandbox that allows government agencies to, in fact, test and, if need be, sort of bring constituents in to do the testing without sort of a more public deployment, well before production deployments, and at each step in the way, of the model development. And that we should just say that can range from very simple things like just some prompt engineering to much more complicated model development exercises. And so part of that message there is to make sure that we have the appropriate infrastructure to facilitate the inclusive AI development, right? And that there are lots of folks out there that are thinking about that, and our friends in Europe have actually put it into law.
That's such a really great point to bring up. Austin, how about you? What challenges have you experienced when trying to integrate some of these practices into your work, given that you've developed one of the sort of more prominent methodologies around this as well?
I was thinking about this question. There's so many layers to it, but I think a really interesting and very common natural sort of difficulty that comes with it. It's the sort of conflicting needs, the types of trade-offs that come with working and trying to do participatory work and trying to prioritize what types of elements and needs you bring in and focus when there are conflicts, when there will always be. And, you know, when talking to teams and uh, engineers and technologists and other sort of experts trying to do this work and understand the sort of complexities that comes with it, it's it's a natural difficulty. And I really liked the discussion around the disagreements because it's a good thing, you know, as Juanes was mentioning, this is a good thing, and it really leads to a real investigation of how this should be done and the priorities and how to prioritize. And we spent a lot of time trying to work on this element of understanding trade-offs in the priorities that should be set in, understanding how to implement based on these conflicts that come about without increasing harm. So if there is a situation where there is a perceived conflict between, let's say, a convenience and a safety issue, a convenience and a privacy issue, pushing back against the binary thinking there becomes really fundamental. And although it's always a challenge, especially if the resources are lacking or there's like a lack of willingness to engage in that discussion, or like the translation of what is being identified from the community side to the implementation side isn't being done in a way that might be translated into implementation well, can really rattle the experience. But actually, I think it's one thing that really leads to thinking more innovatively, really thinking more in a way that we can build for the types of features we want, and there are options. And I think some of the ways within which bringing in different expertise in different areas of the team has led to some of the most innovative work by thinking out of the box, and also understanding that it really requires you to sit back and think about who you are prioritizing when it comes to these trade-offs and questions. So it's kind of a mix of an answer to you, where I wanted to keep to like so some of the really forward-thinking element of this work, that it is possible. I think often that the difficulty of the vast trade-offs leads to something good sometimes.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things that I learned from you that is definitely present in the guidance that you provide is to not equivocate between some of these issues, that there are, you know, some communities are experiencing very real present and current harms versus, as you're saying, like the, you know, issue of like a convenience sort of being less convenience or a friction point existing. And these are all things that we now are very fortunate to have a lot of literature and like research already on. So we're not starting from ground zero trying to discover what these things are, but that we can actually still do a fair amount of research, talking to folks, or even doing just desk research and reading to learn about some of these existing harms and sort of longstanding social inequalities that exist before we sort of jump in to do this work. Juanis, I'm going to turn to you now to sort of round us off on this question. And I think folks are especially curious to hear from you as someone who does work within a sort of large tech company. You know, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced when doing this work for yourself and when trying to guide your teams to do this work?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna sort of echo Stephen's emphasis on infrastructure, because tech companies usually have a large infrastructure around user studies and focus groups. I think the 20th century was big on that, and it solidified itself, but it doesn't always translate or map into the kind of inclusive participatory work that's oriented at understanding societal risks and harms. And so I think companies need to develop infrastructure around that within companies and then across the ecosystem. I think that's a big challenge. Another challenge that I'm seeing, especially in AI now, is that the AI industry is just moving way too fast. it's moved so fast. And so what happens for technologists there is that they'll have a participatory engagement, and within a month, they're working on something else. And so there's no continuity with the engagement, with the groups, the communities that they're trying to sort of either get input from, collaborate with, or co-create with. And I think that that is sort of like a big challenge. The last one I'll say, and I don't know if everyone feels this way, but I, as a historian, really feel this. It's that groups often go, okay, we need perspectives from communities, participatory work, let's go. And I'm often reminded of the fact that we already have a lot of experience with technologies being deployed in social context and going wrong. And so I think a lot of people need to sit down and, as you were saying, Tina, do the desk work to gather as much information as they can before they start the engagement.
Asani, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, actually, that great answer actually reminded me about something that I was thinking to add here. One, the point around the fast moving nature of things. From our side, the type of work we do from civil society and the side of trying to bring into the dynamic, the experience of communities, this vast and geopolitical race around AI really does hamper some of the work we do, not only in terms of where certain projects might be sidelined, or what I've seen a lot is we'll have a project that's leading somewhere good, and then at some point in the pipeline, there's like a added AI level onto the changes coming in. And obviously that creates a really heavy dynamic of trying to ensure the needed harm reduction changes coming in, but trying to battle with the corporate incentives that are coming in there, and it is difficult. I think it's important to also mention that there's like a vast, and it's something that in a lot of our work and guides we hide out to how to try and avoid this vast push towards the weaponization of the different technologies that are being created, and we're seeing it play out around the world in wars, genocide, and the harm that we're seeing everywhere. And providing these tools to technologists that want to imagine different futures becomes really fundamental, because the pushback is heavy. But one other thing that's just like my sort of perception and what I've learned from working with companies, and actually would be really good to see if you all can chime in on this because you'll have more experience. What I've noticed, and it comes back to me often, is, for example, if we're bringing in documentation, whether it's in a form of exact harms and issues, whether it's in the form of scenarios, whether it's in the form of whatever form that needs to get to a team, we've seen there's this like siloing of like the technical teams, whether it's the engineers or other members of the team, from understanding of the background, so like the social technical background, to which creates this sort of vacuum in implementation, and that's been difficult. We've managed to somehow maneuver and have some more and more sort of success in working directly with engineers, but some of these folks really point to the fact that they have no idea sometimes what's happening on the ground, and how that would be vital in understanding how to build around the issue that's being brought up. If it's not just told them build this thing in this way because, let's say, a product manager or another team member had being in the consultation process. And I think that sort of element of when we're talking about participatory, and I know this is in the guides, about bringing in all the different members of the team so that they understand these broader, and it is a continuing issue. And I think our panelists are much better to answer this. One of the folks I interviewed mentioned that this is actually a historical element from the 70s, where trying to keep the engineers out of the sort of broader process so that there's this immunity when the harms come in afterwards, sort of keeping this neutrality of the technical work, which doesn't really exist. And I think that's something that we need to change, and slowly, I think, getting better. But it's a more, I think, technical challenge.
Yeah. I know I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure we can get to some of the questions from the participants. Stephen, I'm going to turn this one to you because you mentioned the EU AI Act. From Joshua Williams, how do policy frameworks and governance structures influence the pursuit of inclusive AI development? Do they serve as strong allies in promoting diversity and accessibility, or can they become obstacles that stifle innovation and equity? And I feel like given a lot of the work that you do with government entities, like this is a good question for you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thanks, Joshua. I'm currently doing some research for with Code for America on state government AI usage and have looked at talk about desk research, have looked at most of the executive orders and a lot of the legislation that's been proposed and or passed in state legislatures in the US. And I would say for the most part, there is, some interest, if not codification of responsible, at the very least, AI practices and everyone sort of has sort of duly expressed their concerns in what we're seeing. And we've seen a proliferation of proposed bills at the federal level. We will see if any of that sort of gets through. I would just say, though, in general, as well, to make a comment that I was at a dinner with some nonprofits and institutional funders last summer, and people were sort of decrying that AI is like sort of social media where it's just going to sneak up on us, and all of a sudden it's going to be we're not going to realize all the harms that it's causing. That's not my view. I just feel like there is so much activity, groups like the Partnership on AI, bringing, who has some convening power, bringing folks together to really address these issues in reasonable and reasoned ways. That, now you can go take these tools and this thinking and apply it in different contexts. There's a lot of that activity happening, and government actors are certainly paying attention to this kind of activity in their policy making. And so I am a bit more hopeful. I also, also that industry is looking for some support, actually looking for at times for regulation. And so it's um it's a different sort of operating space in some ways because there is this personal view because there's so much uncertainty around it and so much uncertainty about where it's heading that people want constructs and ways of looking at things and generally want to be good actors. And so there's just a lot of activity on this, and I think government's taking it and policymakers taking it very seriously and incorporating it.
Yeah. Juanisa Nafsane, did you want to chime in, especially around this point around, is it going to help or is it going to stifle innovation?
I think from my perspective, depending on what kind of policies are being made and who's being consulted and who's working in it, really differs. So it's harder to answer that question, but it's a great question. But I think the sort of necessity in certain elements doesn't ever negate innovation if innovation is being done in the sort of process of tech for people. And I think again, I caveated it with the type of policy and who's being consulted, because there are policies that are made that sometimes have gaps for those most impacted and may be framed in a way that might do more harm than good. But I think there are a lot of organizations as well that are doing this kind of work, where they are doing the work of consultation with communities on the ground. I know Witness.org is doing a lot of this sort of consultation with communities around the world to feed that into the policy making and work they do around the world, and other organizations that do this. And I think the question of whether it stifles innovation, I think, is one of those sort of pushes that we see as a narrative that's expanding more and more, that it distorts the idea of what innovation is rather than what we're trying to innovate towards. So yeah, that's how I feel about those issues we're seeing today, honestly.
Yeah, I have a very similar answer to Afsane, because, you know, if there's a product that's being developed and there's a participatory engagement, and we find out that the communities say, this is not a good idea, this is bad. And then you're like, okay, well, we need to stop. Okay, if that's the example, you might say, okay, it's stifling the product from reaching an audience. But oftentimes in participatory engagement or in general, different community members actually need things. They do want solutions to certain problems. That seems to me to promote innovation. And so I think it really depends on how we look at it. And yeah, I agree. Like when we think about it as a sort of broader narrative, then we get stuck, I think.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point that, one of the benefits we see of like doing this kind of engagement work is like people will help you actually identify the actual problems that need to get solved and like the best way to actually go about doing it. And so I think to your point, Juan, is like you may not get to build the initial thing that you had in mind, but you're going to get to build something, and probably something that's even better, because even as you said, like if you build the wrong thing, people are just not going to use it. Like and so you're almost sort of in a better position to be able to innovate alongside the community rather than sort of on an island by yourself. I know that we're quickly running out of time, so I just wanted to address a question that was dropped in the chat by Nathaniel, where it seems like the tools and insights right now are from the perspective of the developer side. And I just want to call out that is absolutely correct. We were trying to narrow down this big problem of how do we guide the field to do this work more inclusively and with the engagement of the public. And as we've sort of already noted, like it's not just developers, like tech policy needs to be done in this way, social impact work and tools need to be built this way. Because we also see civil society organizations and who are also trying to seeking out tools that they can use to help do their mission-driven work better. The whole field, not just commercial developers, need this kind of guidance. And so we decided to sort of tackle this piece in part because we had access to a unique expertise around industry practitioners who were willing to share some of their insights with us. But the second part of your question is that there may be something missing, would be empowering folks from the practitioner direct service side of social impact to be leaders or at least stronger liaisons for this part of the inclusion. And I think all of us have actually thought about this, and we were thinking about like, what would a resource look like if we were flipped, right? If it were about introducing folks who are doing the on the ground work, dealing with issues around social inequality, to understand the technology in a way that makes them feel like they're empowered to like be part of this process. And so that was not part of this particular mandate, but it was definitely strongly on folks' minds. But I think you could also read this guidance from that perspective to understand like what are technologists, developers thinking about, and where do I have expertise to help shape their pathways. And so if you are on that side of being a direct service provider or practitioner, thinking about technology for social impact, still use this guidance, still use the tools that are there, because I think it'll just give you a slightly different perspective and you can sort of add your own layers to it. But we have a few minutes left and I want to close out with a panelist. I know these are challenging times for a lot of us who are particularly working in the social impact space, in social inequality, like trying to address social inequality issues with everything that is happening. And I think my tendency is to be a little bit doom and gloom. So I want to end on a more positive note. Which is what changes in the field have you observed that give you a bit of optimism or hope about the role of socially marginalized communities in developing this tech, or just in general right now about the direction that tech is going in? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy I'm happy to jump
Thank you,
in
Steven.
as a
Yeah.
positive. I would say the work I'm seeing at the community level is really inspiring. So folks from the community and from marginalized communities and working in marginalized communities. And I would say it's happening in two ways. One, through Project Evan, we're supporting with Google.org 100 CBOs across the country in their AI adoption. And to an organization, they are doing so in very reasoned and inclusive ways, and sort of how they're thinking about what AI work they're going to take on to actually solve problems in their community. And it's happening at this local level, which is so neat. And just the other thing I'd say, and quickly in reference to Nathaniel's question, is we're building some tools that would, like prompt libraries, agent libraries, prompt building tools that would allow folks to take sort of the collective wisdom. So if you figured out a homelessness outreach model um, in New York City, why do we need to rebuild that in every other sort of municipality in the country? Why not share that, localize it? And that sort of like shared intelligence is sort of like we're building some tools on that I'm really excited about.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. So glad that you're doing this work. Juanis, did you want to jump in?
Yep. I think in terms of hope for me, I mean, just even working with everyone else in the global task force and with you, Tina, is just that's what gives me hope, because there's other people doing this kind of work in different places, and I really believe in the multi-pronged approach. We need people everywhere working on this, and so to see that that's happening gives me hope. Learning from one another also gives me hope. And then the other thing is that I I, I think when we turn cynical or negative, that's actually a good thing, because we are not imagining something that's not the case. I think it's good when we remain skeptical. That also gives me hope, because we can identify the actual problems. So yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Afsane, I'll let you have the final word.
Pressure. Okay, thank you. This is really great, and I agree with my co-panelists. I think those are really salient and important things to be left off with. And I think for me and the colleagues and others who we work with, you have to really work from a place of hope too, because otherwise it's really difficult and sort of unconstructive to kind of do the type of work that especially we do and others in my type of work. Is you really have to move from a place of hope to push for and identify the sort of changes in the futures you need. And I do have also a lot of hope in seeing the way we're seeing more and more resistance in the status quo of how things have been pushed out, whether it's through, community-based development of tools, whether it's through, localized, international and national localized missions and work. And I think there is a hope in the fact that more and more folks are seeing that there isn't one way of doing things, and the market does not dictate our futures. We do. And we're seeing that more and more because it's becoming intertwined in everyone's lives. In the way the turn politically is going around the world, these questions and the moves and the decisions the technologists make, that companies make, even outside of the priorities of leadership, become fundamental. So I think that is a place for hope for a lot of us, and to continue pushing.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you to the panelists for such an excellent conversation.